Poland is a country rich in history and culture, but also in mysteries and legends. Among the darkest and most intriguing is the myth of vampires. These supernatural beings, who feed on human blood and have the power to return from the dead to haunt the living, were once feared as a real and dangerous threat. In this video, we will explore how fear of vampires influenced funerary practices and popular beliefs in Poland during the 16th and 17th centuries, uncovering the secrets and macabre rituals surrounding these beings. Poland, with its rich tapestry of history and legends, holds within it some of humanity's darkest and most intriguing myths. Among these, the myth of vampires stands out not only for its dark narrative, but for the profound influence it had on the customs and practices of ancient people. At the heart of this collective fear was the fear of the supernatural, which dominated the imagination of rural and urban communities in medieval Poland. Vampires, cursed beings who returned from the dead to suck the blood of the living, were more than characters in macabre tales. They were seen as real threats that could emerge at any time. To combat this invisible threat, Polish communities developed a series of burial practices that aimed to prevent the rise of these undead. These rituals, known as apotropisms, were meticulously planned methods of warding off evil and ensuring that the deceased remained in their graves. One of the most common practices involved burying bodies face down. It was believed that, when buried face down, the deceased would have more difficulty rising from the grave. Another preventative measure included the use of metal padlocks and chains, placed around the corpse's feet or neck. In Pien, a village in southeastern Poland, archaeologists from the Nicholas Copernicus University of Torun discovered, in July 2023, the remains of a child buried face down, with a triangular padlock near his feet. This discovery is a clear example of how these practices were rooted in popular culture and beliefs. The methods didn't stop there. In 2022, in the same village, the body of a young woman was found with a padlock on her big toe and a sickle over her throat. The scythe, positioned so as to decapitate the vampire if he tried to get up, was an extremely important tool. Other times, stones were placed in the corpse's mouth or stakes were driven into their hearts to ensure they remained where they were buried. These practices may seem bizarre and archaic to us today, but to the people of that time, they were necessary measures to protect the community. The belief in the existence of vampires was deeply rooted in the collective psyche and was reinforced by tragic events such as epidemics, unexplained deaths, and other misfortunes. The prospect of a loved one turning into an evil creature that would return to cause more suffering was unbearable, leading people to adopt these apotropaic rituals. Apotropaic burials in Poland reveal a lot about the mentality and fears of people at that time. Each archaeological discovery gives us a window into a world where the supernatural and the natural intertwined in complex and terrifying ways. However, these methods were more than simple superstition. They were ways of dealing with the unexplainable and the unknown, trying to bring a sense of control over the overwhelming fear of death and what might come after. Apotropaic burial practices in Poland are not just ancient history, they have been confirmed and detailed by fascinating archaeological discoveries. Archaeologists investigating Polish cemeteries from the 16th and 17th centuries have unearthed clear examples of these apotropaic burials, revealing the fears and beliefs of people of that era. Each tomb found provides a glimpse into a world where the supernatural and fear of death profoundly shaped rituals and traditions. In July 2023, a team from the Nicholas Copernicus University of Torun made a remarkable discovery in Pien, a village in southeastern Poland. The remains of a child were found buried face down, with a triangular padlock near his feet. This type of burial was a clear attempt to prevent the deceased from getting up or leaving the coffin. The padlock, symbolically and physically, was a barrier against the dead person's return to life. This discovery is a clear example of the application of apotropaic rituals to contain the potential evil that the dead could pose. Present. The team from the Nicholas Copernicus University of Torun didn't stop there. In 2022, they had discovered in the same village the body of a young woman with a padlock on her big toe and a sickle over her throat. The presence of the scythe was particularly significant. Positioned to sever the vampire's head if he tried to rise, the scythe served as a drastic and final measure to ensure that the dead did not return to haunt the living. This practice demonstrates the level of fear and seriousness with which these supernatural threats were treated. In addition to padlocks and sickles, other tools and methods were also used in apotropaic burials. Stones were often placed in the mouths of corpses to prevent them from chewing or biting if they came back to life. Stakes, often made of wood or metal, were driven into the hearts of the dead to ensure they remained inert. These practices varied in detail, but the intention was always the same: to prevent the resurrection of the dead as vampires. Archaeologists who study these funerary practices seek to understand the reasons and meanings behind these measures. While the specific details may be lost to time, the material traces that remain are an eloquent testament to a world where the supernatural and the fear of death were intimately intertwined. The discovery of each grave with apotropaic elements is not just an archaeological find, but a window into the mental and emotional state of people at that time. These burial practices were not unique to Poland. Similar burials have been found in other Central and Eastern European countries such as Slovakia, Hungary, Austria, and Romania. The frequency of these apotropaic rituals tends to increase during periods of collective tragedies, such as epidemics, wars, or famine, when people seek to attribute misfortunes to the action of supernatural evil. The 17th century was particularly difficult for Poland, with foreign invasions, internal conflicts, economic crises, and outbreaks of plague contributing to the climate of fear and superstition. Archaeological discoveries reveal more than just the methods used to prevent the rise of vampires. They also illuminate the psychology and culture of the people who lived at that time. Each excavated grave is a piece of the puzzle that helps us understand how collective fears shaped burial practices and rituals. The way the dead were treated directly reflected society's beliefs and anxieties, offering a glimpse into a world where fear of the supernatural was a powerful and constant force. The village of Pien in southeastern Poland has become a focal point for archaeological discoveries that illustrate the depth of fear of vampires in the High Middle Ages. Excavations carried out by the team from the Nicholas Copernicus University of Turin have revealed not only the presence of apotropaic practices, but also the lasting impact of these beliefs on local communities. Each new find at Pien adds a layer of understanding about how these funerary traditions were rooted in everyday life. One of the most intriguing discoveries occurred in 2022, when archaeologists unearthed the body of a young woman. She had been buried with a padlock on her big toe and a sickle held over her throat. The function of the padlock, similar to that found at the child's burial in 2023, was to physically prevent the deceased from getting up. The sickle, strategically placed to decapitate the woman if she tried to get up, was a drastic measure to ensure that, if she came back to life, she would be immediately prevented. This use of the scythe is particularly revealing of the visceral fear that vampires inspired. It was a clear symbol of the determination to avoid any possibility of return. The sickle, an agricultural instrument transformed into a weapon against the supernatural, demonstrates how everyday objects could be rethought in contexts of extreme fear. This practice, of transforming common tools into protections against vampires, shows the creativity and adaptability of popular beliefs. Furthermore, it reinforces the idea that the threat of vampires was seen as a tangible and imminent danger, requiring practical and effective measures. Other tools used in apotropaic burials included stones, stakes, and coins. Stones were often placed in the mouths of the dead to prevent them from chewing or biting if they returned to life. Stakes, driven into the hearts of corpses, were perhaps the most iconic and widely recognized measure against vampires. The coins, in turn, in addition to serving as symbolic payment for transporting the deceased to the other world, could also have been seen as magical barriers against the return of the deceased. Seen as magical barriers against the return of the dead. These funerary practices were not unique to Pien, but the village has provided a rich field of study due to the concentration and preservation of apotropaic burials. Ongoing excavations have allowed archaeologists to build a detailed picture of how these traditions evolved and were practiced over time. Each discovery at Pien contributes to a greater understanding of the fear of vampires and how it influenced social and religious practices. The inhabitants of Pien, like many others throughout Poland and Central Europe, lived in a world where the supernatural was an accepted and feared part of reality. The 17th century was a particularly turbulent period, marked by invasions, internal conflicts, economic crises, and outbreaks of plague. This climate of uncertainty and suffering exacerbated collective fears, making apotropaic rituals a natural and necessary response to protect the community against invisible evil. Pien's practices exemplify the constant struggle between life and death, the natural and the supernatural. They reflect a time when the unknown was often explained through mysticism and fear. The methods used to prevent the return of the dead were both an attempt to control the unexplainable and a tangible manifestation of people's deep fears and deep-rooted beliefs. Apotropaic burials and fear of vampires were not exclusive to Poland. They were deeply rooted in diverse cultures of Central and Eastern Europe. These rituals, although varying in detail, reflected a collective response to the fear of the supernatural, which transcended borders and permeated the everyday lives of various communities during the High Middle Ages. In Slovakia, Hungary, Austria, and Romania, practices similar to those observed in Poland have been widely documented. In each of these countries, vampire prevention methods exhibited unique characteristics, but they all shared the same purpose: to prevent the dead from returning to haunt the living. These funerary practices tended to be more frequent during periods of collective crisis, such as epidemics, wars, or famine, when suffering and high mortality exacerbated fears of the supernatural. In Romania, for example, the use of wooden stakes driven into the hearts of the dead was a common practice. This method has become an iconic image associated with vampires, perpetuated through centuries of legend and folklore. The tradition of staking bodies to ensure they would not be resurrected was seen as an effective measure against the threat of vampires, reflecting a deeply rooted belief in the ability of the dead to return to life. Additionally, Romania is famous for its vampire stories, especially the legend of Vlad the Impaler, whose historical figure significantly influenced stories of vampirism in the region. In Hungary and Slovakia, archaeologists have found graves containing corpses with stones placed in the mouth or on the chest. These stones were intended to prevent the dead from chewing or rising from their graves. This type of practice demonstrates a regional variation in the apotropaic approach, using everyday objects as symbolic barriers against the return of the dead. In Austria, as in other regions, coins were often placed in the mouths of the dead. This practice served both as a symbolic payment for crossing to the other world and as a measure to ensure that the dead did not return. The use of coins, in addition to their spiritual implications, was seen as a way of blocking the passage back to life. These apotropaic rituals, spread throughout Central and Eastern Europe, highlight the ubiquity of the fear of vampires and the profound influence these beliefs had on funerary practices. The 17th century, in particular, was a period of intense hardship for many of these regions, worsened by conflicts, economic crises, and outbreaks of plague. In these uncertain times, the dead who were not accepted into Christian cemeteries for a variety of reasons, such as having died violently or suddenly, committing suicide, contracting illnesses, having physical deformities, or not being baptized, were often seen as potential vampires and buried in isolated and unmarked places. Archaeologists, when studying these practices, face the challenge of interpreting the reasons and meanings of these anti-vampire rituals. While many specific details may have been lost to time, the material traces that remain provide us with a window into the world where the supernatural and the natural mixed in complex ways. These archaeological remains are silent witnesses to a past where the constant fear of death and the unknown profoundly shaped funerary traditions and practices. Regional differences in apotropaic practices offer a fascinating insight into how different cultures and societies confronted fear of the supernatural. Each country and community adapted its own versions of these rituals based on their unique cultural and historical contexts. However, the essence of fear and the need to control the return of the dead was universal. The 17th century was a period of intense difficulties for Poland, marked by a series of crises that profoundly affected society and contributed to the strengthening of beliefs in the supernatural, including the fear of vampires. This specific historical context offers a deeper understanding of how and why apotropaic rituals became so prevalent during this time. Poland, during the 17th century, faced a succession of foreign invasions, internal conflicts, economic crises, and plague outbreaks. These collective calamities not only devastated the population, but also created a climate of fear and uncertainty that fueled popular beliefs in the supernatural. The Swedish and Muscovite invasions, known as the Swedish Flood, 1655 to 1660, and the Muscovite invasion, were particularly devastating, causing great loss of life, destruction of property, and economic destabilization. In addition to invasions, Poland also faced internal conflicts and rebellions, such as Cossack revolts and civil wars. These ongoing struggles have undermined the country's stability and exacerbated economic difficulties. Hunger and misery spread, increasing mortality and creating an environment where fear of death and the supernatural thrived. The outbreaks of plague that ravaged Europe during the 17th century did not spare Poland either. The bubonic plague, in particular, had a devastating impact, killing indiscriminately and without warning. The speed and violence with which the disease killed contributed to panic and despair, leading people to seek supernatural explanations for the calamity. Those killed by plague, often buried hastily and in large numbers, were viewed with suspicion and fear, considered possible agents of supernatural evil. In this climate of crisis and fear, beliefs in vampirism and the need for apotropaic rituals found fertile ground. Apotropaic burial practices, such as the use of stakes, stones in the mouth, and prone burials, were desperate attempts to control the uncontrollable. Communities sought to protect themselves not only from the tragedies that had already occurred, but also from the invisible threats they believed were lurking. The dead who were not accepted in Christian cemeteries for a variety of reasons, such as having died violently or suddenly, committing suicide, contracting diseases, presenting physical deformities, or not having been baptized, were often seen as potential vampires. These individuals, considered outside the social and religious norm, were buried in isolated and unmarked locations, reinforcing the idea that their death could be a portal to supernatural evil. Archaeologists studying these apotropaic rituals in Poland face the challenge of interpreting a past where the natural and the supernatural were closely linked. The discoveries of graves with preventive measures against vampires reveal a society deeply marked by fear of death and the unknown. Each excavated tomb is a window into the anxieties and beliefs of the people of that time, offering a glimpse of how they tried to cope with the uncertainties of a world in crisis. Understanding these funerary practices not only illuminates the beliefs and fears of 17th-century Polish society, but also offers insight into how social and economic crises could influence supernatural beliefs. The fear of vampirism and the measures taken to prevent it reflect the attempt to bring order and control in a world where death and suffering seemed omnipresent and inescapable. Apotropaic practices observed in Poland find fascinating parallels in other European cultures, reflecting a widespread fear of the undead and a universal desire to protect the living from supernatural evil. Each culture has adapted its own burial traditions to address the perceived threat of vampires, influenced by their unique social, economic, and historical conditions. In Romania, vampire stories are particularly rich and involve historical figures such as Vlad the Impaler, whose cruelty and brutal methods of execution inspired many of the region's vampire legends. Romania is perhaps most famous for its vampire traditions due to Dracula, a literary character based on Vlad, who perpetuated the image of the vampire throughout the world. Here, the use of wooden stakes to impale corpses suspected of vampirism was a common practice, intended to ensure that the dead remained inert. The practice of impaling, an extreme measure, demonstrates the deep fear and seriousness with which vampirism was treated. In Slovakia and Hungary, archaeologists have discovered graves containing bodies with stones placed in the mouth or on the chest. Just as in Poland, these stones were intended to prevent the dead from chewing or rising from their graves. The choice of stones, a common and readily available element, reflects the urgency and accessibility of preventive measures taken by local communities. In Austria, in addition to stones, coins were often placed in the mouths of the dead. This custom had a dual function. It served as a symbolic payment for the crossing to the other world and as an apotropaic measure to ensure that the dead did not return. The tradition of putting coins in one's mouth also connected with ancient Greek beliefs about Charon, the ferryman of the underworld, who demanded payment to transport the souls of the dead across the river Styx. Thus, the intersection between ancient pagan practices and new Christian concerns shaped funeral rituals in the region. In Germany, practices to protect against vampires included placing grains of wheat or sand in the grave, in the belief that vampires would be forced to count each grain, delaying their return. This type of practice, known as compulsion, demonstrates a more psychological approach to the problem of vampirism, trying to trick the undead with endless tasks. These varied methods of protection against vampires reflect the richness and diversity of European cultural traditions. However, they all share a common characteristic: the attempt to control and prevent the return of the dead, mitigating the fear of the supernatural. Each culture developed its own solutions to a common problem, adapting everyday elements and religious beliefs to their funeral practices. Apotropaic practices in Europe were often more prevalent during periods of great crisis and change. Epidemics, wars and famine created an environment where fear of death and the unknown intensified, and people sought supernatural explanations for the problems they faced. This need to understand and control the inexplicable led to the development of complex and varied rituals to protect the living from the dead. Archaeologists, when studying these rituals in different regions, face the challenge of interpreting the motivations and beliefs underlying each practice. Although the specific details may vary, the essence of apotropaic practices remains the same: an attempt to bring order to an uncertain and threatening world. Each grave discovered with preventative measures against vampires is a piece of a puzzle that reveals the human struggle against the unknown and the fear of death. As we continue to explore these traditions in various European cultures, we realize that the fear of vampires was a universal response to a very human fear: the fear of the inexplicable and uncontrollable. These burial practices not only reflect people's supernatural beliefs, but also their attempts to find comfort and security in times of crisis. As we move forward in time, we observe a significant transformation in beliefs and practices related to vampires. What began as a deep and widespread fear of the supernatural, rooted in funerary practices and apotropaic rituals, has evolved over the centuries in response to social, political, and cultural changes. The 17th century marked a culmination in anti-vampiric traditions, but as Europe entered modernity, these beliefs began to metamorphose. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the Enlightenment brought a new era of rationalism and skepticism. Apotropaic practices and beliefs in vampires began to be seen as irrational superstitions, not compatible with the advancement of scientific knowledge. However, rather than disappearing completely, the vampire myth adapted, finding new forms of expression in literature and popular culture. Authors such as John Polidori, with The Vampire, 1819, and Bram Stoker, with Dracula, 1897, redefined the figure of the vampire, transforming him from a feared creature of folklore into a complex and seductive character of Gothic fiction. The literary vampire retained some of his apotropaic characteristics, such as his aversion to stakes, garlic, and crosses, but was portrayed in ways that reflected the cultural anxieties and fascinations of his time. These writers helped cement the image of the vampire in the collective imagination, making him a central figure in horror literature. In the 20th century, the vampire continued to evolve, adapting to new media. Film and television expanded the reach of the myth, introducing the vampire to global audiences. Iconic films such as Nosferatu, 1922, and adaptations of Dracula solidified the presence of vampires in popular culture while reflecting social and cultural changes. The vampire has become a symbol of several contemporary issues, from the exploration of sexuality to fear of epidemics and moral decay. Apotropaic traditions, although less practiced, have not completely disappeared. In some rural regions of Europe, there are still reports of rituals performed to protect against the return of the dead. These rituals are often performed as part of cultural heritage, preserving ancestral practices and keeping the connection with the past alive. The rediscovery of apotropaic graves by archaeologists continues to fascinate and educate, offering a glimpse into the ancient beliefs and fears that shaped the lives of our ancestors. Today, the vampire is a multifaceted figure, found in various forms of media, from books and films to video games and television series. The image of the modern vampire is often ambiguous, oscillating between terrifying monster and seductive anti-hero. This duality allows the vampire to continue to be relevant, reflecting the complexities and contradictions of contemporary society. The evolution of vampire beliefs, from the apotropaic practices of the High Middle Ages to modern representations in popular culture, reveals much about the human condition. The fear of the unknown, the attempt to control death, and the fascination with the supernatural are recurring themes that span the centuries. Ancient burial practices and vampire stories are testaments to our ongoing search for meaning and security in an often uncertain world. Ultimately, the study of anti-vampire traditions and beliefs associated with vampirism offers a window into the human soul. It reveals how we deal with our deepest fears and how we transform those fears into narratives that help us understand the world and ourselves. As we continue to explore these stories and practices, we can learn not only about the past, but also about our own nature and the challenges we face as a society. Vampire legends and myths, enriched by centuries of beliefs and traditions, continue to capture our imagination. They remind us that while forms may change, the essentials remain: the desire to understand and master the unknown, and the search for ways to protect what we hold dear. Apotropaic practices and vampire stories, therefore, are not just vestiges of a distant past, but living parts of a cultural continuum that connects us to our predecessors and guides us toward the future. By exploring the mysteries of funeral practices in Poland, we delve into a world where fear of the supernatural profoundly influenced life and death. If you liked this video, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications for more intriguing stories full of mystery. Leave in the comments what else you would like to know about the legends and myths around the world. To the next.